It is 1981. Members of a small community called Valle Nuevo near the rural town of Santa Marta, El Salvador are on the run, flying through the hot night air along treacherous mountain paths, desperate to reach the Honduran border. Right-wing government death squads supported by American aid money had gunned down Archbishop Oscar Romero the year before. Women they knew had been raped and murdered and their children tortured. A few weeks earlier, a local carpenter left for work one morning, and community members found him dead with nails pounded into his skull. Now the government behind these atrocities was intent on killing an entire community of indigent farmers for their purported guerrilla or communist sympathies. Joe Gatlin, Nancy Gatlin, and Joel Scott's recent book Compañeros begins in the aftermath of what happened next. Women, men, and children, many of whom did not know how to swim, threw themselves into the Lempa River, trying to reach a UN refugee camp on the other shore. Many did not make it. Soldiers on the ground and helicopters in the air shot people in midstream. Others drowned. The killing went on for hours. Across El Salvador, more than 70,000 people were killed in the decade-long war, many at the hands of death squads like those that terrorized the people of Valle Nuevo. Fast forward to 2018. Last year the Trump administration announced that it would end temporary protected status for El Salvador, a program for immigrants displaced by environmental disasters and political instability. Around 262,500 Salvadorans live in the United States under the program, but the Department of Homeland Security has said they must leave the country by September 9, 2019. If they do not leave voluntarily, they will face deportation. Many of these men and women left El Salvador during the war, others after the region suffered a 7.6 magnitude earthquake in January 2001. Still others left after the Central American Free Trade Agreement with the United States, CAFTA, gutted the local economy in many communities, flooding the market with cheap American corn and making it effectively impossible for local farmers to make a living. Gang activity increased in the capital, San Salvador, and even obtaining clean water in some local areas became extremely difficult. Today, remittances, that is, money sent home to El Salvador from family members living in the U.S. and other countries, make up about 17% of GDP, and 1 in 3 Salvadoran households receives them. Much of that money comes from those who have temporary protected status in the United States. In October, a federal judge temporarily blocked the Trump administration's effort to shutter TPS, welcome news for many Salvadorans whose immigration status is tied to the program. The September 9 end date has so far remained unchanged, so the fate of Salvadoran TPS recipients still hangs in the air. Unless the court ruling is made permanent, or the Trump administration relents, less than a year from now El Salvador may begin a long slide into a ruinous recession and perhaps even civil unrest. Many men and women with TPS have settled down, raised families, and become integral parts of their communities in the United States. And, though they often help support family members back in El Salvador, there are few prospects for rebuilding their lives there. Their old connections are gone, former communities changed forever. That includes jobs. Employment is unlikely to simply materialize for these deported families upon arrival. In fact, since remittances make up nearly a fifth of El Salvador's economy and much of that money comes from TPS recipients, a significant portion of their economy will evaporate with the deportation of these families from the United States. So will many of the jobs created by that money. All of El Salvador, not just the third of Salvadoran households that depend on remittances, will suffer, so much so that the end of TPS could create an entirely avoidable humanitarian crisis in one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. Rural communities like Valle Nuevo would be hit hardest. Then there are the U.S.-born children of TPS recipients, all 190,000 of them. Parents facing deportation are confronted with the terrible question of whether they should deny their U.S. citizen children a future in the United States with the wealth of opportunity it affords, or leave them behind to grow up without parents. Unless TPS is reinstated, former recipients from communities like Valle Nuevo have no good options. This is the argument advocates for Salvadorans with TPS will be making over the next year. In this case, however, unlike the ongoing controversy over children separated from their parents at the border, the Trump administration has a legitimate and reasonable riposte available. Temporary protected status was never meant to be a permanent program, administration officials might say. It is, by definition, a program intended for the most extreme international crises, extraordinarily destructive natural disasters and civil wars, for example. If we took in every migrant who comes from a region without an economy, half the planet would be at our border. Keeping migrants in family detention is cruel. Remember Japanese internment camps. Separating them from their children to avoid family detention is even more inhumane, and releasing them under their own recognizance creates huge shadow populations of undocumented people. We simply do not have a good way to keep such large numbers of Central Americans here. Therefore, the best and most just course of action, the administration might argue, is to deport them post-haste. One does not find Valle Nuevo by accident. Sensantec, which boasts a population of more than 41,000, is more than an hour away. The only road that leads into town winds around mountains and along sheer cliffs. One can easily imagine a rock slide or even a drowsy driver coming the other direction and sending a vehicle tumbling into the jungle below. Sometimes the dirt road suddenly turns to broken rock and moving more than a few miles per hour becomes impossible. The town announces itself slowly, a cinder block house with an aluminum roof barely visible from the road, a few chickens or an emaciated dog roaming free, a man with a machete ambling slowly down the road offering a nod or a buenos. The new preschool, paid for partly with funds from an American church group, Shalom Missions Communities, appears on the right, and one wonders not only how the children learn without air conditioning in the tropical heat, but how they deal with the cement outhouse that looms behind the school. A heavy black tarp is draped over its front, in lieu of a door. Soon more houses appear, including one modest but modern adobe home that, if it had central air and reliable plumbing, might fetch several $100,000 in some cities in the United States. A sign remittances have been at work. Other houses have a few inner rooms, a kitchen, a bedroom or two, and a long, aluminum roof held in place by exposed rebar. Under that roof children play or men talk quietly in the shade. Then on the right, opposite the Catholic church and a large field used for soccer and games, La Cancha, one sees the combined primary and high school, a gloomy cement edifice surrounded by concrete walls. During the day, noise from overcrowded classrooms can be heard from the street below. Broken glass has been cemented into the top of these walls all along the road to deter gangs or anyone who might consider attacking the school. A mural dated 2017 decorates one section of the wall that faces the street. In its top right-hand corner, plumes of smoke emerge from black factories and an iron sky dominates a grim cityscape. At the bottom left, however, is an entirely different scene. Women and men wearing vibrant colors, animals and birds, fruited trees, crops, and lush vegetation combine into a tableau that seems almost to dance before the viewer. This scene represents Valle Nuevo and, perhaps, Salvadoran life generally. Descending from the smoggy upper right, however, comes an enormous human head with sharp, jagged teeth. The head threatens to swallow the townspeople and their way of life whole or rip them limb from limb. Visitors understand the message when they see Uncle Sam's top hat decorated with the stars and stripes riding back on Behemoth's head. CAFTA and American economic policy have not provided opportunity for the majority of Salvadorans. Rather, though many Valle Nuevo youth graduate from high school and some earn college degrees in San Salvador, there is no one to hire them and no market to which an entrepreneur can appeal. Americans can always undersell them. It stands to reason that many of these youth decide to try their luck in the United States. Some of them know that coyotes, men who charge exorbitant rates to smuggle people through Mexico and into the United States, might decide to traffic young women, require additional fees at random, or just take their money and run. Even those with college degrees might end up working undocumented in South Texas, California, or Alabama for a few dollars an hour, when their employer is willing to pay them. But staying is often worse. Business owners and government officials suffer extortion by gangs. One Valle Nuevo woman closed her business last year rather than comply. If a young woman catches a gang member's knife, she often has a choice of becoming his personal possession, being murdered along with her family, or emigrating. Young men risk their lives whether they join a gang or refuse. All this happens because the government is too weak or too corrupt to prevent it. But even if locals somehow overcome all this, band together as they did to organize the local greenhouse, run the new health clinic, or fight for their land titles against a government who refused to grant them until 2016, even then, there would still be no jobs. One detail of the mural on the school wall often escapes those viewing it for the first time. Clearly, the artist wants to convey that a predatory and violent America has economically pillaged a formerly pristine El Salvador. He or she might add that American arms killed whole families during the war and that now cheap American corn has destroyed many people's livelihoods. The preference of the artist for the Salvadoran life over the American dream, a preference perhaps both aesthetic and moral that is shared by many community members, is unmistakable. But many visitors to Valle Nuevo and Santa Marta miss an important detail about the figure that dominates the center of the piece: the monstrous Uncle Sam threatening to ravish the community. An odd but telling shock of yellow hair protrudes from under his red, white, and blue hat. Listen long enough to the older members of the Valle Nuevo community and discussion inevitably turns to the Civil War. Pedro, a former member of the city council, called the Directiva, remembers where in the river or on the opposite shore friends, family, and neighbors fell that night in 1981. Other older men recall dropping everything the night the community fled and running to confront the advancing government forces in a desperate attempt to protect their families. Many remember Mesa Grande, the UN refugee camp over the Honduran border rife with disease and malnutrition, and nearly everyone over 40 can date their return to Valle Nuevo and recount the backbreaking work it took to rebuild and recreate their community. If TPS ends for El Salvador on September 9, 2019, all the work these men and women have done and their plans for the future may begin to unravel. More than 5% of the Salvadoran economy could disappear. Unless those who had TPS can find another ground for gaining an immigration status, usually a family member who will sponsor them, they have little hope of ever living a normal life in the United States. Almost all TPS recipients have already tried these legal avenues anyway. For many of these Salvadorans, that means deportation. 200,000 Salvadorans, including many single young men, may be sent home without the prospect of work, and if that happens, the immediate future for communities like Valle Nuevo is grim indeed. Without remittances, many families' income will dry up completely. Businesses will lose customers, lay off employees, and close their doors. Young men will face the choice of joining a gang or spending their days in fear with no other prospect for making a living. The Trump administration could hardly foment unrest more effectively if it tried. But what is the alternative? TPS has never provided a pathway to citizenship. One cannot even become a permanent resident through the program. It was always intended to be exactly what its name claims: temporary. Shadow populations, increased immigration from Central America, and more separations of migrant children from their parents will be the inevitable result if USCIS, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, and Homeland Security reinstate the program. There are no easy solutions to this political Gordian knot. There is, however, a path forward. That path begins by ending the Central American Free Trade Agreement, an agreement that limits El Salvador's ability to protect itself economically. It may hurt a few of the richest Salvadorans, the figurative, and sometimes actual, descendants of the Catorces Grandes, the 14 families that ruled the country until relatively recent years. But it will help most Salvadorans. Farmers and small business owners will not be undercut by cheap American food and goods. Salvadorans will have a voice in whether to allow the international mining companies that have run down so much jungle and polluted so many water sources onto their soil. If CAFTA is discontinued, many families in places like Valle Nuevo will be able to make a living through the Salvadoran economy for the first time. Such a path only allows El Salvador to do what the United States has already done to its closest allies under the Trump administration: impose tariffs on U.S. goods and protect itself from trade practices that harm the Salvadoran people. If CAFTA were shelved, some of America's rich would undoubtedly lose out. Some American companies would move production of certain products from Central America, where labor has been cheaper, to other locales, sometimes back to the United States. American workers would then have more jobs to choose from, and, since those companies would have to compete for workers, higher hourly wages. Both American and Salvadoran working classes would benefit if the Trump administration cut CAFTA and in time the flow of migrants from Central America through Mexico and into the southern United States might slow to a trickle. Ending CAFTA is the long-term solution to El Salvador's ills and America's immigration question, not continuing temporary protected status for El Salvador. Nonetheless, given the risks for regional stability, it is urgent that the Trump administration re-up TPS anyway, for the shorter term. If they do not, by the end of the year the Trump administration may have a humanitarian crisis on its hands.